Yes, the US government put poison in alcohol in 1926. But that is not the part that will stay with you. The government controlled every barrel of industrial alcohol in the country, every formula, every chemical added before it left the facility. They knew bootleggers were stealing it, stripping the additives, and selling it as whiskey in speakeasies across every major city. So in 1926, they made a calculation. They did not shut the bootleggers down. They did not cut the supply. They did not increase the raids. They made the alcohol more poisonous, deliberately, on paper, with a signed budget. By the end of that year, over 1,200 people in New York City alone had been poisoned. Hundreds went blind. Hundreds more died. The reports landed in Washington every single week. The government read them. Then they raised the dose again. 10,000 Americans were dead by the time Prohibition ended in 1933. Not one person responsible was ever charged. What you are about to understand is not just what was in those bottles. It is the exact decision that put it there, who kept making it, and what it reveals about something that did not begin or end with Prohibition. January 16, 1920. The 18th Amendment takes effect. Alcohol is not reduced or restricted. It is banned outright. You cannot make it, sell it, or serve it. The most widely consumed social substance in the country disappears from every legal shelf in a single day. What Washington did not account for was 30 million Americans who still wanted a drink. Within months, an underground economy was running at full speed. Speakeasies opened in basements, back rooms, and barbershops. New York City alone had over 30,000 of them by the mid-1920s, more than twice the number of legal bars before the ban. But the alcohol had to come from somewhere. Industrial alcohol was still legal. Factories needed it for paint, fuel, and cleaning products. Millions of gallons moved through government-monitored facilities every year. Bootleggers figured out quickly that they could divert this supply, strip the chemical additives with basic chemistry, and sell what remained as whiskey or gin. The government tracked this. They had the numbers. They knew exactly what was happening. And they chose not to close the supply, not to secure the facilities, not to block the diversion routes. They made a different choice. The program had a name: denaturing. Industrial alcohol had always contained additives to make it undrinkable. Small amounts of methanol, trace compounds, enough to discourage casual consumption. But starting in 1922, the Treasury Department began expanding the formulas significantly. The reasoning, written clearly in internal documents, was straightforward. If the diverted alcohol made people sick enough, demand would drop. They were not targeting the bootleggers. They were targeting the end of the chain, the person who bought the bottle. By 1923, federal formulas required methanol at concentrations that could cause permanent blindness with a single heavy dose. Alongside it, pyridine, benzene, kerosene derivatives, chloroform. The denaturing list eventually grew to over 70 different compounds. Bootlegger chemists fought back. They hired their own people to reverse the process before the bottles reached customers. Some succeeded, some did not. And the people buying cheap drinks had no way of knowing which side of that chemical race their bottle had come from. They just drank it. The hospitals started keeping records. By 1924, city health departments across the country were filing formal reports with Washington. Emergency wards filled every weekend. The pattern was consistent across cities. The chemical cause was identified in every autopsy. The reports named the compound. They named the source. Washington received every one of those reports. Now here is where the story turns. In 1926, rather than reviewing the program, the Treasury Department upgraded it. The methanol requirement in industrial alcohol was increased to 10%. Some formulas went higher. The official justification, documented in government records, stated that previous concentrations had proven insufficient to deter consumption. People were still drinking, so the answer was more poison. That single decision is what separates this from negligence. Negligence is not reading the reports. What the records show is a program that read the reports, measured the outcomes, determined the deterrent effect was insufficient, and increased the formula. That is a policy response. It has a paper trail. It has signatures. Within weeks of the 1926 increase, the poisoning numbers in cities across the country jumped sharply. In New York that year alone, 1,200 poisoning cases were recorded. 400 people died. Hundreds more lost their sight permanently. That is when Charles Norris walked into the story. New York City's first ever chief medical examiner. A precise, methodical man who believed the dead deserved an accurate account. He had been building files on the poisoning cases for years. Chemical reports, autopsy findings, survivor testimony. A documented record of what the denaturing program was producing in actual human bodies. On December 28, 1926, 3 days after a Christmas week that killed 23 people in his city, Norris called a press conference. He did not use careful language. He told reporters that the deaths in his morgue were not accidents. The people dying were workers and fathers who had bought a drink their government had turned into something else entirely. He read the chemical findings aloud. He named the federal formula. The government's formal response was a press statement. It said that individuals who chose to violate the law accepted the consequences of that choice. That was it. That was the full answer. You broke the law. What happened next was yours. Now look at who was dying. The wealthy did not drink bootleg industrial alcohol. They had supply chains the denaturing program never touched. Imported whiskey from Canada and Britain moved through private clubs and well-connected distributors. Clean, untampered, expensive. The people drinking denatured alcohol were in the cheap speakeasies, immigrant neighborhoods, working-class districts. People who had no alternative supply and no way of knowing what was in the bottle they just paid for. Norris documented this specifically. The hospital records showed it. The death toll did not fall randomly across the city. It concentrated in the poorest neighborhoods in every borough. Senator James Reed of Missouri put it directly on the Senate floor. He read from the health reports. He said the program was killing people who could not afford better, while those who could afford better drank without consequence. He called it by a name that the chamber did not challenge. But he could not stop it either. The program ran through 1927, 1928, 1929. The formula held. The death toll climbed. The reports kept arriving and kept being filed. By the time Prohibition was repealed in 1933, historians estimate 10,000 Americans had died from the denaturing program. Tens of thousands more were permanently disabled, blinded, or neurologically damaged. The 18th Amendment was repealed on December 5, 1933. The denaturing formulas were quietly retired. No announcement, no acknowledgement, no review. The offices that ran the program simply moved on. Charles Norris spent his remaining years trying to get a formal congressional investigation opened. He documented over 1,000 deaths in New York City alone, attributable directly to the federal formulas. He submitted formal requests to Washington. No investigation was ever opened. He died in 1935. The officials who designed the 1926 formula expansion retired with their careers intact. Some were publicly recognized for their work enforcing Prohibition. The families of the dead received no formal explanation. Survivors who lost their sight received no compensation. There was no hearing, no monument, no moment of official acknowledgement. And here is the detail that closes this story. The program was not hidden while it was happening. Norris held press conferences. Senators gave speeches. Newspapers printed the death counts. The information was available to anyone paying attention. What was never said clearly by anyone with the authority to say it was this: the deaths were not a side effect. They were the mechanism. The program worked by killing people until others decided the risk was too high to keep drinking. That is what the documents show, not an inference. The internal justification was deterrence. The deterrent was poisoning. The measure of success was whether people stopped drinking after watching others die. They did not stop, so the formula got stronger. 10,000 people, 0 charges, 0 acknowledgements. And when you understand how the math worked, when you see that the people who died were specifically the people the program could afford to lose, the question that remains is not really about alcohol. It is about how a government decides whose death counts as a cost and whose counts as a consequence. That line has been drawn before 1926. It has been drawn after. The specific policy changes. The framework that makes certain lives expendable does not announce itself the same way twice. But it leaves the same paper trail. You now know what it looks like. If that changes how you read the next official statement that tells you someone brought their suffering on themselves, then this did exactly what it was supposed to do. There is more history sitting in the public record that has been filed, noted, and quietly moved past. The next story is already waiting. And after what you just heard, you already know you cannot afford to miss it.